I will be focusing more on the actual debates in Kant scholarship around these issues. And I will say something about what I think about these debates, but that is going to be in a very preliminary spirit. I'm still working out these issues, so I'll be grateful for comments on that. So I'm just going to read it out first, and then we can talk about it. So in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, and the more recent Swiss panel on human dignity, which was 2011 document, the Swiss document is titled Protecting Dignity, an Agenda for Human Rights. Humans are distinguished from non-humans because they possess an, quote, inherent dignity, end of quote. This is from the UNHR preamble, also in protecting dignity. This inherent dignity of humans is then made the basis for human rights. Since all humans share equally in the dignity of being human, all humans can be said to have equal and inalienable rights, irrespective of race, gender, economic status, etc. Further, as the Swiss panel document states explicitly, and this is implicit in the UN Declaration, philosophers have, quote, grounded the claim of human dignity and the uniqueness of human beings in the human free will, in the capacity for moral choice and individual autonomy, end of quote. The Swiss document illustrates this as follows. If a journalist publishes a critical article, and if she is, quote, subjected to rape or any other form of torture aimed at extracting a confession or changing her opinion, end of quote, then this can be seen as a direct attack on, quote, the core of her dignity, end of quote, because it, quote, restricts her free will, autonomy, and moral choice, end of quote. And this is the illustration that the Swiss document gives us. Now, it has been said that in its emphasis on the notions of autonomy and free will, this popular notion of human dignity has its roots in Kant's philosophy. Right? Prabhesh also mentioned that. More recently, however, in his book on the Kant on human dignity, Oliver Sensen has argued that the notion of human dignity, as it is enshrined in the UNHR document, what Sensen calls the contemporary notion, is different from Kant's notion of human dignity. So this new work by Sensen basically is trying to argue that the notion of dignity in the UN document is different from Kant's notion of human dignity. Right? According to Sensen, unlike the contemporary notion, the UN notion, which presupposes that humans have some sort of intrinsic value and therefore possess dignity, Kant thinks that human beings acquire dignity because the categorical imperative or the moral law commands that humanity be respected. Right? So it's actually the opposite, right? In this essay, I will raise a preliminary doubt regarding Sensen's proposal. I will argue that Sensen does not exclude the possibility that, for Kant, both humanity and the moral law might together make possible the notion of human dignity. I begin with a very brief overview of Kant's moral philosophy in section 1. Subsequently, in section 2, I will articulate Sensen's view and outline his responses to some of the criticisms it has generated. Finally, in section 3, I will raise a doubt regarding some aspects of Sensen's view. Right, that's what I'm going to do. So, I start with a brief overview of Kant. That's going to be interesting for us, essential for us here. So, Kant is concerned with the conditions of the possibility of morality. The goodwill that forms the basis of moral action is purely rational in the sense that it has nothing to do with sensibility, our contingent desires and emotions. Therefore, it is valid for all rational beings. Kant distinguishes between the divine will from the imperfect will of a rational being, like a human being. A divine or purely rational will has no imperatives because it can never be at odds with the commands of reason and so can never have an imperative. In contrast, human beings can either will to act morally or act in accordance with sensible inclination, that is contingent desire and emotion. Such a will, the human will, unlike the divine will, can take itself as following an imperative. And the moral will, of course, the moral human will is going to be categorical imperative. For Kant, there are two sorts of imperatives, categorical and hypothetical. The hypothetical imperative is a conditional, that is an if-then claim. If you want happiness, if that's your end or purpose, which Kant characterizes vaguely as the sum of all inclinations and relates ultimately to this fulfillment of our sensory desires, then you must choose a particular set of means, that is, perform a set of actions conducive to gaining happiness. Here reason is in the service of an inclination. In contrast, the categorical imperative is a command of pure reason that must be obeyed for no other reason but that reason commands it. So if there's a conflict between what the categorical imperative demands, and that is to act in a way that your action can be made into a universal law, so not lie, for instance, because lying cannot be universalized, and inclination, we would morally act if we choose to act on the basis of the categorical imperative or the moral law. So if conflict between inclination and the categorical imperative, choose the categorical imperative, then you will follow it. So we freely, or as Kant says, autonomously, choose to act in accordance with pure reason or the moral law. We do the right thing, whatever that may be, for no other reason than that it is the right thing to do, and it is the right thing to do because our reason or the moral law. So impressive. The purpose of doing the right thing lies in our doing it, and we freely choose to do the right thing even if it conflicts with our inclinations. If we were to follow our inclinations in contravention of the moral law, then we would be acting heteronomously like animals do rather than autonomously. For instance, if we lie for the sake of our happiness, then we are acting heteronomously, while we would be acting autonomously if we refuse to lie simply because lying violates the categorical imperative, even if we believe that lying in a particular circumstance would aid the achievement of our happiness. Right? I now present Senson's view and the contours of the debate it has generated. So now, brief overview of Kant. I'm going to talk about Senson's view of Kant on human dignity and the debate that it has generated. As already mentioned, Senson argues that the contemporary notion of human dignity is at odds with Kant's characterization of this notion. The contemporary view presumes that human beings have dignity, and so must be respected because they have value. If Senson is right, then in actuality for Kant it is, quote, because one should respect humanity that humans have an importance and dignity, end of quote. Right? And this injunction to respect humanity is derived from the categorical imperative and therefore is a, quote, direct command of reason. Right? What this means is that on the contemporary view, dignity is a special kind of value that all humans share. It is prior to all other considerations, and it is something that a person cannot lose. Senson takes this special kind of value to be, quote, a distinct metaphysical property that human beings possess inherently, end of quote, and concludes that Kant does not possess such a notion of value. Right? This is because for Kant, morality would have to be taken as heteronomous if it were grounded on the basis of such a metaphysical value. After all, if we can value other humans on the basis of an intrinsic value that they possess and which we can discern in them, then we are valuing them on grounds that are independent of our reason. This implies that we are not acting autonomously, which involves giving ourselves the law that we should value something. In opposition to this view, Senson claims that for Kant, value is a, quote, prescription of reason, end of quote. That is, the moral law specifies what we value, and we value it because we autonomously give ourselves the moral law. Right? So, to quote Senson, quote, value is something one is committed to valuing by the dictates of one's reason. Right? So, basically for Senson, morality is has primacy, is prior to humanity. You value humanity because morality says so. And for the human rights document or the human rights notion of dignity, it's the other way around, right? Humans have this intrinsic metaphysical dignity, right? And you respect them because they have this particular dignity, right? So the dignity for Senson is in the moral law, dignity for the UN document is in humanity, right? So if human dignity on Senson's view of Kant is not a value that grounds our respect for humanity in our person and that of others, but this respect is based on the law of reason, then what is Kant's view of human dignity? Right? Senson claims that Kant's notion of dignity is influenced by the Stoic notion of dignity. The idea that something has dignity because it is raised above something else. For instance, a senator is raised above others on account of his political power. Humans above animals because they are rational, and so on. Similarly, dignity for Kant is not, according to Senson, a normative or moral notion, but expresses, quote, a relation that one thing X is raised above another thing Y, end of quote. Now at first sight, this seems to go against Kant's claim that what has dignity has, quote, absolute inner value, absolute worth, right? So this view seems to go against this particular claim that Kant explicitly makes. However, Sensen contends that the absolute inner worth or value is based not on the intrinsic value that humanity might possess, but on the intrinsic value of the moral law. It is morality that has dignity in the Stoic sense. That is, it is raised above all other considerations in the sense that, quote, only morality should be pursued unconditionally, end of quote. If we accept this view, then human dignity is not some non-relational or absolute metaphysical property that is valuable irrespective of any circumstances or relations that humans enter. Rather, corresponding to the Stoic notion of dignity, Kant thinks that dignity is a, quote, way of saying that morality is elevated or special, end of quote. So to say that something has absolute inner value is to say that it is valued unconditionally, and for Sensen's Kant, quote, respect for the dignity of the moral law is the moral motive, end of quote. As Sensen puts it, quote, morality has not just a subordinate relative value or price, but an elevated inner worth, dignity in worth, end of quote. Now, if it is morality and not humanity that has dignity, then how does one explain Kant's claims that human beings and all rational beings are ends in themselves? Right? This is basically the Kant's groundwork claim, right? That we should treat our humanity and that of others always as an end and never as a means. Right? So how do we explain this? Right? But Sensen says that Kant does not mean this as a normative claim. This groundwork claim is not a normative claim for Kant. Right? So Sensen says that Kant does not mean this as a normative claim that humanity should be considered an end in itself, but rather as a descriptive claim that it is only because human beings have freedom that they can be considered ends in themselves and not mere means for nature's ends. Finally, Sensen cites passages showing that human beings feel respect for the moral part of themselves, that is, for the command of the moral law. Kant says that a human being quote, regarded as a person, that is, as the subject of a morally practical reason, is exalted above any price, end of quote. And Kant also says, quote, feeling of one's inner worth, valor, in terms of which one is above any price. So Kant says that human being regarded as a person, and the person who has this which is above any price, has its basis in following the moral law. So, in freely following the categorical imperative for its own sake, humans are able to feel self-worth that cannot be given a market price. So, in autonomously following the moral law, you feel a self-worth that cannot be given a market price. In other words, humans respect themselves for their moral capacity. They also respect other humans for the same reason. In Sensen's view, this is evidenced by Kant's claim that just as someone would not, quote, give himself away for any price, this would conflict with his duty of self-esteem, so neither can he act contrary to the equally necessary self-esteem of others, end of quote. This is from the Metaphysics of Morals. This claim that we respect or value the moral capacity in ourselves and others leads to Sensen's further claim that for Kant, all humans should be respected since they have the same moral capacity irrespective of whether or not they actually possess a good will. So irrespective of whether they're actually giving themselves a moral law or not, they all can potentially, they all have the same moral capacity. In this context, Sensen makes a distinction between initial dignity and realized dignity. The initial dignity of all humans is that they are elevated with respect to nature, because they have reason and freedom. Realized dignity is the duty to realize one's initial dignity, which is to develop a good will. So this was Sensen's position. Now some of Sensen's key claims on Kant and human dignity have been contested by other Kant scholars. I now briefly enumerate some of these claims. Right? So this was Sensen's view. Now what criticisms have been made against Sensen? So first, in opposition to Sensen's claim that it is morality and not humanity that has absolute value, Jochen Wojanowski argues that it is humanity that has absolute value, right? So absolute value. Sensen is saying it's morality that has absolute value, not humanity. Bojanowski says no, it's humanity that has absolute value. Because we have the capacity to act from our self-consciousness as practical cognizers. That is, we are able to act in accordance with, we as human beings are able to give ourselves a law and act in accordance with the categorical imperative. What constitutes the condition under which alone a rational being can be an end in itself has inner worth, that is, dignity. Morality is the condition under which a rational being is an end in itself. Therefore, morality or humanity, to the extent it is capable of morality, is the only thing that has dignity. So there's a kind of, again, now primacy humanity view, right? Only to the extent the human being has morality, right, or is capable of morality, is a human being is going to have dignity. And according to Bojanowski, this somehow makes humanity prior to morality. So he thinks that this is actually, doesn't really go much into detail in this argument, but and also one can sort of critique the way Bojanowski is doing this. But he thinks that the fact that we are capable of giving ourselves the moral law is what makes, and as humans we do that, is what makes human primary and not morality, right? Because we have to give ourselves the moral law. Right? Second, scholars have questioned Sensen's claim that Kant does not possess the notion of value as a metaphysical property. So basically, Sensen says that Kant doesn't think of value as a metaphysical property at all, right? Dieter Schoenecker argues that even if we grant that it is the categorical imperative that has absolute worth, as it is for Sensen, this does not necessarily entail Sensen's other claim that value is not a distinct metaphysical property for Kant. Right? Schoenecker asks if Sensen would not consider the categorical imperative to be a value, and if he would, then why would it not be thought of as a distinct metaphysical property? Right? But Sensen argues that value and the categorical imperative function differently. We do not see the categorical imperative as something precious in ourselves or others. Instead, the categorical imperative commands directly. Many things can be considered good, but the categorical imperative expresses the unconditional ought commanded by reason, and therefore it cannot be viewed as a value that we would be required to weigh against other values. Similar to Schoenecker's criticism of Sensen, Bojanowski argues that if we cannot know the good independently of the moral law, and if, in knowing what we ought to do, our cognition, quote, affects us through the feeling of respect for the moral law, end of quote, and the good is realized in action, then both my human ability for practical cognition and the actual action that I perform must have some inner metaphysical value, right? However, Sensen argues that Bojanowski has not shown how we get from feeling of respect for the moral law to the metaphysical value property of the human mind, right? So even if you think that humanity is what's primary for Bojanowski, and through the feeling of respect, you can know when you're following the moral law. How do you go from that to saying that value is a metaphysical notion for Kant, right? At least Bojanowski, Sensen says, has not shown that. In any case, Sensen says, positing value as a metaphysical property goes against the first critique claim that we cannot gain access to the intelligible properties of sensible things, since all knowledge comes from the senses. Third set of criticisms against Sensen. Several commentators have challenged Sensen's argument that for Kant, humanity is not an end in itself, and therefore dignity is not the intrinsic worth of human beings. Sensen responds, however, that reason does not give humanity as an end in itself, which then grounds the categorical imperative. Instead, there are only two ends given by reason, according to Sensen, and that's clear from the metaphysics of morals. Reason gives only two ends, and it's not, humanity is an end in itself, it's not given by reason. The two ends are one's own perfection and the happiness of others. So reason only gives two ends, one's own perfection and the happiness of others. Okay? Both of which actually follow from the categorical imperative. Therefore, we do not rationally make humanity an end, but humanity, according to Sensen, is, quote, an independently existing end, something that, quote, as an objective end ought as a law to constitute the limiting condition of all our subjective ends, end of quote. The end in itself, Sensen says, means valuing something for its own sake. But with respect to humanity, an end in itself is not, quote,
a way of specifying how one values something. Instead, human beings exist as end in themselves, independently of what one values. So they're ends in themselves independently of what one values. This is against Senson's position. In this context, Schoenecker cites a passage from Kant's lecture notes where Kant says, quote, "The human, namely, is the end in itself, Zweck an sich selbst. He can therefore only have an inner worth, rather than only have an inner worth, that is Würde, dignity, in whose place can be posited no equivalent." End of quote. This is from the Fairbairn lectures, lecture notes, and Schoenecker quotes this. But according to Sensen, the therefore in this passage, so this is the passage basically says the human is the end in itself, and therefore he can have inner worth and dignity, right, which has no equivalent, right? So Sensen sort of focuses on the therefore. He says, but according to Sensen, the therefore in this passage shows that one must move from the notion of end in itself to the notion of inner value, and it is not clear what makes this move possible, right? So for Sensen's Kant, some intrinsic value in humanity does not make us value ourselves and therefore others, right? Rather, we value humanity because it is demanded by the categorical imperative as an obligation, right? Morality, not humanity, is the end in itself that has dignity and absolute worth, as opposed to all other ends that have a relative price, right? Now, these are some of the few criticisms. So I've talked about Sensen's view and some of the criticisms that have emerged in the literature. Now I will sort of talk about, give you a sort of preliminary argument as to why I think Sensen is, if not wrong, at least he has not excluded all possibilities from within the context of Kant's works, right? So I'm going to give you a counter argument against Sensen's view. So I will now point to a possibility which, at least prima facie, Sensen does not take into account in justifying his position. One could argue against Sensen's claim that it is the moral law and not humanity that is. One could argue against Sensen's claim that it is the moral law and not humanity that is the end in itself and has absolute worth or dignity, but without giving in to any kind of value realism that Sensen wishes, in my view correctly, to exclude. Such a view, at least to begin with, can be given some textual grounding, as I now show. So I'm rejecting. So this view will reject the value realism, but will contend that Sensen is wrong to think that morality is primary in endowing us with dignity, and not humanity. Morality and not humanity is primary in endowing us with dignity. But I think he's right when that Kant doesn't have a metaphysical notion of value that people like Bojanowski think Kant does, for instance. So Sensen wants to insist upon the primacy of morality over humanity in specifying what has absolute worth or dignity in Kant's moral philosophy. But in my view, he does not preclude the possibility that, for Kant, morality and humanity related in some reciprocal way could make for absolute worth or dignity. Right? So this relationship between morality and humanity, if it is reciprocal, that is, at least to begin with, I think, a better way of making sense of a lot of passages that Sensen himself cites, right? So if Sensen is saying primacy of morality in endowing dignity, Bojanowski is saying primacy of humanity in endowing dignity, I'm saying that there's a kind of reciprocity between morality and humanity, and that's what gives us this notion of absolute dignity, right? So if such a claim is, so the claim that I'm making, if such a claim is defensible, then this would mean that contra Sensen, humanity in my person is an end in itself in the same way as the moral law and therefore has absolute worth. This could also further mean that for Kant, humanity has absolute value such that value is not viewed as a real metaphysical property. On this view, we reject Sensen's claim that humanity does not have absolute value, but we accept his view that Kant does not think of absolute value as a real metaphysical property. Further, this view can also accommodate two other important aspects of Sensen's interpretation. First, the claim that value lies in reason, and second, that Kantian dignity should be understood along Stoic lines as the elevation of morality over everything else. So with respect to the first claim, so I'm trying to show how these two claims can be accommodated in the view that I'm proposing. So with regard to the first claim, the claim that value lies in reason, one could say that reason gives absolute worth to morality and humanity at the same time. That is, they are reciprocal concepts, at least when it comes to human beings, although this need not obviously be the case for all rational beings. With regard to the second claim, that Kantian dignity should be understood along Stoic lines, one can still take Kant to hold that dignity is the elevation of something over other things, except that now this elevation would not merely include morality as Sensen would have it, but also humanity. Right? So you can still have an elevation notion, except that now what is elevated is not just morality as for Sensen, but morality and humanity as on my view. I now offer some textual evidence for the claim that both morality and humanity can have absolute value in Kant's system, since they are reciprocal concepts. Right? So this is the position that I'm proposing, at least as a counterexample to Kant, and I am now trying to give you some textual evidence for this. So first, in the groundwork, Kant says that it is not inconsistent with the wisdom of nature that the cultivation of reason, which is requisite for the first and unconditioned purpose, end of quote, may restrict the attainment of the second purpose, which is happiness, which is always conditioned. So basically the claim is that you can, nature can be organized in such a way that the cultivation of reason, which is unconditioned, right, it can possibly restrict the second purpose, which is our own happiness, right? So basically the reason-happiness dichotomy and how that can be reconciled, right? Further, and this is from the groundwork, further, Kant says that the goodwill already exists, again in the groundwork, Kant says that the goodwill already exists in the sound human understanding and only needs to be elucidated. Both these passages from the groundwork make two claims. That reason needs to be cultivated and the moral law has to be elucidated. Now, if these tasks of cultivation of reason and elucidation must be done autonomously, then they must be freely willed. So, in essence, in the case of human beings, willing the categorical imperative would require some active contribution on our part, and this minimally would require the cultivation of reason and the elucidation of the moral law. Therefore, given that the human will must cultivate, elucidate, and give itself the moral law, one could argue that this giving itself the law in the human case is as essential as the categorical imperative. Therefore, the categorical imperative and the human willing of this imperative could be viewed in reciprocal terms and put together form the basis of human dignity. So basically the claim is that it's not just the law, morality is important, but you have to give yourself the law, right? And that requires cultivation of reason, that requires elucidation of the moral law. So that's something that you have to do. It's an active process. Now what that is, still an open question, right? But it's an active process in some senses. And the question is, what sort of activity is this, right? And must this activity be put at the same level as the moral law, the categorical imperative that's already there in the sound human understanding, right? Similar passages can be found in the Critique of Practical Reason and the Metaphysics of Morals. In the second critique, Kant says, quote, recognition of the moral law is, however, consciousness of an activity of practical reason from objective grounds, which fails to express its effect in actions only because subjective pathological causes hinder it, end of quote. Here, the activity of practical reason is characterized as objective and therefore must relate to the categorical imperative of the moral law, and this activity must go hand in hand with the recognition of the moral law, which, since it requires conscious recognition, could at least in this passage be related to human beings. Right? So, now, this passage is ambiguous because it's not clear how, when you talk about recognitional consciousness, how that is to be related to the human will, right? I mean, do we have this kind of recognitional consciousness in the divine will or not, right? So there can be possible counter-arguments against the use of this particular passage to support what I'm claiming. But it's still, the fact that he's talking about the distinction between recognizing the moral law versus subjective causes, the fact that that distinction is being made shows that he obviously couldn't be talking about the divine will, right? Because the divine will has no subjective part. It just has the moral, purely rational part, right? So this passage is evidence, albeit somewhat weak, that the moral law and the human legislation of the moral law go together. Further, In the metaphysics of morals, Kant distinguishes between moral and psychological personality. And here again, morality and humanity must go together in the case of the moral personality. Kant says, and I quote, "A person is a subject whose actions can be imputed to him. Moral personality is therefore nothing other than the freedom of a rational being under moral laws, whereas psychological personality is merely the ability to be conscious of one's identity in different conditions of one's existence." From this it follows that a person is subject to no other laws than those he gives to himself, either alone or at least along with others. So again, it's a question of giving oneself the law. This active process of giving oneself the law is something that, at least for the human being, has to go with the moral, the explication of the moral law, which is already built into the sound human understanding. Finally, the key, so since my claim is that morality and humanity are both reciprocal in giving us dignity, the key passages, of course, emerge in the Critique of Practical Reason. So, in the Critique of Practical Reason, Kant is concerned with the question of whether freedom can be considered the property of the human will, and he asserts quite plainly that freedom and the categorical imperative are reciprocal. Quote, "Freedom and the unconditional practical moral law reciprocally imply each other." End of quote. Further, in a crucial passage from the Metaphysics of Morals, in which he makes the distinction between Wille, lawful willing, and Willkür, arbitrary choice, Kant speaks of the freedom of the will as an ability. So he basically thinks of the freedom of the will as an ability. It's Vermögen, right? And he says, quote, "Only freedom in relation to the internal law-giving of reason is really an ability. The possibility of deviating from it is an inability." Right? End of quote. In other words, human ability goes into following the moral law for its own sake, and the opposite of this is simply following inclination, like animals do, right? Without freedom. On the basis of these two passages, one could potentially make the case that humanity and morality go together, at least in the case of human beings. For if freedom and the moral law are reciprocal, and if freedom to follow the moral law is an ability that human beings possess, then humanity and morality must go together. Consequently, the two together must form the ground for dignity or absolute value. In conclusion, I have shown that there are at least preliminary reasons to further investigate Simpson's conclusion that the contemporary notion of human dignity is not Kant's notion of human dignity.